Hi everyone. I'm going to guess that most of you at least are somewhat familiar with ORCID. Yes? So I'm not going to go into lots of detail. I know Pat doesn't want us to spend too long on this because we want to spend most of the time on the discussion. So I just wanted to run through a couple of slides about the role that ORCID and actually other persistent identifiers can play in kind of legitimising scholarly content in blogs, because I think part of the challenge for blogs is blog posts is that they're not at the moment kind of used in the same way as, say, an article or a book or another kind of publication. So they won't necessarily have a DOI or another type of identifier. The authors may, or in most cases probably don't, use an ORCID ID, or in the case of the Scholarly Kitchen, which is a blog that I write for, we were asked to provide our IDs, but as far as I know, nothing is being done with them. So some of those kind of infrastructure options that are utilised in other forms of publication are not being utilised at the moment for blogs, but actually there's no reason why they shouldn't be. So I'm going to focus primarily on ORCID, but I just wanted to set that kind of broader context that ORCID is just one of a number of persistent identifiers and standards and things like that that probably need to come into play if blog posts are really going to be considered part of the scholarly literature. So, and this is with apologies for those of you, and I know there's a couple in the room who've seen versions of these slides before during this presentation, but I'm going to continue to hammer home these messages to you. So you will go away knowing all about what ORCID wants to do and why. So this is, first of all, our vision, and I think it's worth spending a couple of minutes just kind of dissecting this because it's important as part of an understanding of where we're trying to get to. So first of all, ORCID's vision is very inclusive, so we're not just for researchers, we're not just for scientists, we're for anybody who participates in the research ecosystem in any way. So for example, I mean, you just mentioned that all of us have ORCID IDs. I'm certainly not a scholar, the rest of the table I think might be, but at ORCID all the staff have ORCID IDs because we're all contributing in some way to the research ecosystem. So very inclusive. Obviously, an ORCID ID is a unique identifier, but really importantly, it's not just about the identification, which of course is critical for recognition and discoverability and citation, but it's also about connecting that ID with other data, in particular with other persistent identifiers, so that you can make those verified connections between a person and their affiliations and their outputs and so on. And obviously, an ORCID ID is a type of persistent identifier, and that means that it will continue through time. So it's something that you can use the same ORCID ID right throughout your career, from an early career researcher to retirement. It works across all disciplines, and it works across, it's an international standard, if you like. It's an international identifier. So this is our kind of nirvana vision. What we really want is for researchers only to have to enter, or even better, have entered for them their information once, connected to their ORCID ID, and then that information will flow around through the whole research ecosystem that they're interacting with. So the researchers in the middle, their ID is being collected by their publisher or their employer or their funder, who in turn is then connecting information about their grant or their publication or their affiliation to their ORCID record, and then that ORCID record becomes a kind of hub, a data store that can then flow around all the other different systems and services and platforms that the researcher is using. And a close-up look at this for publishers, again, the researcher's in the middle, just entering his or her ID once. That's done in an authenticated way, so the researcher has to actually claim their ID. They have to say, go to their ORCID account and sign in the same way that you do with a Google account or something like that. And in fact, you can do it using your Google credentials if you want to, or your institutional credentials. That ID is then collected by the publisher. It's included in the metadata that's sent, whether it's to Crossref or DataCite or some other organisation, and it's also displayed in the published work so that it's obvious that the researcher has an ID, and you can connect from that resolvable URL to their ORCID record. The publisher then asserts that work, so the publisher says, yes, I've verified that you are the person you say you are, and I now verify that you did indeed publish this output with me. So they assert it back and connect it into the record, and then in an ideal world, that information flows both not just into the ORCID record, but back from the ORCID record into the publisher's systems or whatever, so that there's that synchronization, and from there it can flow through to the other systems that the publisher's using and or to the other systems that the researcher is interacting with, whether that's for publications, employment, funding or anything else. So this is a quick and unfortunately slightly incomplete look at what using an ORCID for in a blog post might look like. So we have just recently introduced a repository. We've set up an ORCID repository on Figshare, and we are now assigning DOIs, Figshare DOIs, to all our own blog posts from the ORCID blog. This is a recent one, an interview with Alison Mitchell from Springer Nature. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work because DataCite's got a bit of a problem at the moment, so it's not automatically updating in the way it ought to. But what should happen, you'll see I'm listed as the author of that blog post. So normally, through my DataCite profile, which I've set up, I have enabled auto-update, which means that when DataCite picks up a new publication with a DataCite DOI, which is what the Figshare DOIs are, it will say, aha, Alice has just published a new work. We're going to push that information back into her ORCID record. But as I say, unfortunately, right at the moment, that little bit of functionality isn't working, so I couldn't give you the grand ta-da, and here it is on my ORCID record, because that's not working. But I promise you, usually it does work, and certainly there's a similar functionality in place for Crossref, so if a blog post had Crossref DOIs, the same thing would happen. So you get this nice sort of automated process where as long as you're using your ID when you publish your blog post, in theory that information can be pushed through and automatically update your ORCID record and then flow into the other systems that you're using. So I think that's all I was going to say.